Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast of liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, and today I'm joined by Mark Blitz. Blitz is the Fletcher Jones Professor of Political Philosophy and formerly the director of the Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom and chair of the Department of Government, all at Claremont McKenna College. He received his PhD and BA in Government and Political Science at Harvard University. Besides being a brilliant and prolific scholar of political philosophy, Professor Blitz has also considerable experience in government, having served as Associate Director of the Information Agency and as a senior staff member on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Have I forgotten anything there, Mark?
No, that's plenty.
I will add as well that my favorite thing about listening to Mark on YouTube videos, of which there are several out there, is he's a very good talker and his points are always very clear and concise, which is not something we can always say for philosophers. So I'm very grateful for that.
Sure. Good. We'll see if we can keep that up.
I'm sure we will. I have no doubt. And thank you so much for being here, Mark.
Sure, my pleasure.
So maybe we could start a bit with your background. How is it that you became interested in political philosophy?
Yeah, when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, in my first year, I took a course that was then called Gov 1A and 1B. It was before numerical inflation. Now these things are 10, 100, 1,000, but 1A and 1B. And the second half of it, the 1B half, was political philosophy. And the course was taught one lecture and two sections, and my teaching assistant, or what we called then section man, indicated that really political philosophy was the most interesting topic. And I became interested in it in a way as I was thinking through my examinations and my other material first year. What happened then in my second year, Harvard had a program where all the undergraduates would have a tutorial that would operate through the house that they were living in, the dorm that they were living in. And I wasn't enamored of what mine might have been. So I was walking across Harvard Yard, ran into a friend of mine who was going to see the man who was then head of the, among other things, the undergraduate honors program, and that was Harvey Mansfield. So I went with him and, kind of complained a little bit to Professor Mansfield that I wasn't thrilled with what I might be having. And then he asked me, well, what had I taken and what were my grades? And then he invited me into his tutorial. And that really, from then on, I set my direction to a large degree in the direction of political philosophy.
Thank you. And you started in government.
Yeah, and that's what I remained. My degrees are all in government. It's political philosophy from the standpoint of government, the history of political philosophy, but not simply in a historical sense. I took, several courses in the philosophy department, but those weren't as interesting or as deep, really, as what I was learning from Professor Mansfield.
And when you made the transition to working in government, where did that decision come from? I have been curious about this part of your biography. When I finished my PhD, they didn't offer me a job in government. I expected it immediately based on your experience.
Yes, and you were disappointed.
Completely.
Well, I taught I was an assistant professor at Harvard for a few years and then at University of Pennsylvania. But I didn't get tenure at University of Pennsylvania for several of the reasons you could imagine. But I was, I had the opportunity to have other academic jobs. But at that point, I decided that it would be more interesting to spend some time in government if I could. And through the various, connections that one has, because it's always somewhat bizarre about how one actually has these positions. I had a position in government. The first position that I had in government was with a domestic agency. It was called the Action Agency. It doesn't exist anymore, but some of its programs still exist, the Peace Corps, VISTA, and so on. Then I went to the United States Information Agency to direct a program. Then I went to the Foreign Relations Committee staff because the staff director was a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine at University of Pennsylvania, who also did political philosophy. And from then I became associate director of USIA. It's a confirmed position, essentially assistant secretary of state now. And my own committee confirmed me. So, and then I went to the Hudson Institute, where I became overall research director. It's a think tank, obviously, a good one. But my true interest, of course, is political philosophy. So I was fortunate to be able to re-enter the academy at Claremont McKenna, where we have many good colleagues.
And how many years have you been at Claremont McKenna?
Since 1996.
Okay, that's a healthy time there.
It's a good chunk of time. That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Are you teaching right now?
I am right now. I'm teaching one course, Introduction to American Government, and I'm teaching one of our sections in the Freshman Humanities Seminar. And then next semester, I'll do the history of political philosophy.
That Freshman Humanities Center, is that a kind of Great Books or Western Civ program or something a little different?
At one point it was that. Now it's a bunch of different things depending on who teaches it. The way I teach it, and a couple of my colleagues teach it, it's something like a Great Books or Western Civ course, but it's certainly not how everyone teaches it.
I see. Yeah, I've definitely encountered people who have similar situations where maybe it began that way. It can still go in that direction, but frequently it's taught differently.
Yeah, and the key thing is who's teaching it. We spent a lot of time talking about the books and the substance, and that's very important. But if it's taught poorly, it's not just useless; it can actually be harmful. So the central thing is the right things taught by the right people, and that's of course very difficult to have.
While we're on the subject of teaching, this is something obviously that interests both of us. You're a very experienced teacher. I'm a novice teacher. What is it that you think makes a particularly good teacher for this kind of great books education? That's one question. And the other point I would just make is that certainly in graduate school, where I went to school, presumably where you went to school as well, they did not put great emphasis, actually, on the teaching that we would be doing. There was not much teaching preparation. We were taught mainly how to be scholars. Do you think that that's sustainable for graduate programs going forward? So, two questions: how do you teach great books well, or what makes someone a good great books teacher? And second, do you think that we're educating professors well enough on how to teach?
To me, what's central in teaching it well is believing that what is in these books could be true, and teaching things from the point of view of the author who believes that these arguments are true when you're doing that kind of material. Or if you're doing literature, teaching it from the point of view of what makes excellence in the material that you're teaching. So I think the seriousness with which you really teach the material, which can come only if you believe that there really is something there. That's the first central thing. You've got to communicate that to your students. You've got to answer their questions. You've got to meet them where they are, but also try to elevate them to where you hope they'll be. I think those things are central. And then the methods that you use to do that, I think, have a lot to do with your own skills, what you're comfortable with, and the class directly. When I was in graduate school, nobody taught anything about teaching, but we all, after you passed your comprehensive exams, or your general exams, as we called them, you then had a section in usually the introductory government course in my department. So you learned to teach, I guess, at the expense of the students who were in your class. I think graduate schools spend more time now actually trying to help their students teach and teach well. What counts as teaching well, of course, is another matter, and what they really are trying to impart is another matter. But they spend more time trying to impart it, at least, than used to be the case.
Yeah, I think both of those points are true. It's from my own experience, there are certainly more teaching focused resources there were at Yale 5 years ago than I suspect there were 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But not all of those resources, well, the less said about that, the better.
Yeah, right. And in my case, it's 50 years ago, actually.
Oh, okay.
Or you know, I had my degree in
Hmm.
1971, my
Hmm.
PhD degree. So
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
no one thought about teaching in that way. You did get,
Yeah.
you know, the whoever the senior person was in the course that you were a teaching fellow in
Hmm.
would talk with you about what you were doing and
Hmm.
talk about the course generally and about the grading. It's not as if you were completely on your own, but
Right.
techniques of teaching and even in a certain sense what the course was really trying to achieve, you were left a little bit more on your own.
Hmm. I'll say that from my own experience, being told techniques and things like that before I had considerable teaching experience, they didn't mean much really. Um, yeah, there's some things you do have to make a lot of mistakes for yourself.
Yes, in my case, the first time I taught one of these sections in introductory political philosophy, I thought I would uh, try to do a version of a Socratic method where I would ask questions and I'd have the answers I thought I might work with to move forward,
Mm,
but it didn't work. So I
mm,
then started doing other things.
mhm. Yeah, I done that many times, as I think most people did, and it requires a lot of patience, obviously, to teach well. But you worked in Congress, so you probably know something about patience.
Yeah, well, Congress is interesting. You learn something about patience, but also it's such a political atmosphere. It's,
Hmm.
you know, most places you are when you're in the academy or even in the
Hmm.
executive branch, they're not quite so intensely political as Congress is. In Congress,
Hmm.
everybody's first or second thought is the politics of it. Who's for?
Hmm.
Who's against?
Hmm.
What will this mean for reelection?
Hmm.
Who are my friends? Who are not my friends? It's a very political atmosphere, which is extremely interesting. So you need
Hmm.
patience, but you also have to orient yourself to that kind of world, really.
Hmm. Sounds tiring.
Well, it's not something that you would want to do very long unless you were a certain type, right?
Hmm.
If you were, because of the very political nature of it, and because of
Hmm.
the ups and downs of it. So there are some people who were on staffs for a long time, but I don't think it's something that you would want to do uh, all that long if you had a
Hmm.
choice.
Hmm. Well, I know that the type that you are is not just a broad thinker, but a very deep thinker. I've been very impressed by uh, the part of your work that I've read and the less of it that I really understood or was qualified to read. So I want to move into some substance here, and this is a question that uh, I feel that for putting it to another thinker might be a little bit perfunctory, but I hope that um, you'll be able to give a real answer to it. And I mean the question seriously. I don't have an ulterior motive here. It's not a trick question. I mean, um, is there such a thing as Western civilization?
Yes, I would say there is. You know, in some ways, you might think of it as a compound, basically, of the thought and the art, poetry
Hmm.
of ancient Athens,
Hmm.
and the great revealed religions,
Hmm.
and the kind of the combination of that, the tension, is I think the nerve of Western civilization, and then the various arguments or the attempts to understand things simply rationally
Hmm.
from the Greeks forward, is really the driving force beyond even that. So there are tensions within Western civilization, both in terms of reason and revelation, but then
Hmm.
obviously also in terms of reason itself. But those tensions uh, don't mean that there isn't something that you could call Western civilization. And I think
Hmm.
that the ground and the heart of it is
Hmm.
is what I've just said.
Hmm. Hmm. So I notice in that description that it doesn't include um, geography, ethnicity, or description of material circumstances. It really is a description that is about ideas and the tradition of ideas. Do you think that? Well, I'm just to observe that and say why is it you think that the ideas are really the core of these things?
Yeah, it's the ideas, but it's also the human freedom and the use of reason that's really the heart, I think, of Western civilization. The full openness of the mind that you see with Plato and Aristotle, and the free use of the mind you see with Plato and Aristotle, the openness to, and in a way, discovery of and working out of virtue, of the real meaning of human excellence and happiness. But then the continued unbridled use of reason, at least for oneself and with oneself, continues throughout. So therefore also the opening to freedom understood as equal natural rights. So, full rational excellence, the real understanding of what human excellence is, the real understanding of the use of reason and the mind, the true exploration of freedom. I think that's what the substance is of Western civilization. And that obviously is not connected to geography. It's not connected to ethnicity. It's not connected to identity. But it is what is common in the true possible height and aspiration and liberation of every human being.
This goes to a question that I've posed to some people on this podcast a few times, which is this is slightly jumping ahead to thinking about teaching great books, but we've been talking a little bit about teaching classes called Western Civilization and also great books. Are we teaching things because they are ours or because they are good? And it seemed like you were further in the direction there of perhaps because it's good.
I think we first of all teach them because they're good. I mean, would one concentrate on teaching what is one's own were it not good? I don't believe one ought to. So the key thing is that they're good.
There are a lot of things that are mine that are not good, and I don't teach those.
Well, you're the judge. But in our case, and here I'm thinking of the United States, not only, but in particular, because that's where we are and who we are, they're also our own. I mean, this is a country explicitly based on thought, on something that's meant to be universal. It's clear that the Declaration of Independence, our true founding document, is based on and is connected to the thought of John Locke and others. So in our case, I think the central heart of Western civilization is in a way our own, as well as what's good. And the American founders referred back to Rome and the Romans, so and Roman republicanism. So the real reason one teaches the great material of Western civilization is because it is good. But in our case, it's also our own and at the heart of our political life and founding.
And do you think that these political traditions, I'm thinking maybe natural rights would be an example, is this something that has to be taught and retaught? Is it something that at this point inheres in our institutions? Does it inhere in our ways of thinking? Do people think this way whether they want to or not? Maybe you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think the real ground and basis and justification of equal natural rights, as well as the limits, need to be taught and retaught. Everything always needs to be taught and retaught, not just for every generation, but for every subunit in generations.
Yeah.
Everything important needs to be taught and retaught. In some ways, a certain understanding of equal freedom is behind lots of what people do and think is good unthinkingly. But they need to think about it in order to really understand what's true and good about it, but also the limits, and also to defend it from those who believe that it's not good and important. So it's not enough that some of it inheres in what we actually do and some of it inheres in our institutions. We need to understand, again, the substance of it intellectually, to defend ourselves, and again, to understand our rights, but also to see the limits so that we use our rights properly and correctly. Because equal rights are true. I think one can give an understanding or argument about why they truly exist naturally, but they're not the whole truth or the only truth, because they don't yet tell you about the excellent or proper use of your rights. So it's necessary to teach, to go through the arguments, to go through the objections, if one is to be serious in one's understanding and really even in one's life.
What do you think is the state of the American public's or citizenry's grounding and knowledge of this tradition today? Do you think we're further away than we've ever been? Do you think we're as far away as we usually are? How would you compute that?
Yeah, I don't know if we're further away than we've ever been, because I don't know all the other times.
Yes.
But we're further away than we were in certain times that I know and remember. You're not taught these things, and you're not taught what is implicitly good about them, so that you then have the base from which to really understand their heart in the same way that we used to be taught. I mean, now people will understand any statement about natural rights, not all people, but too many people, as merely a preference, merely a story, merely a narrative, as people say now, merely an imposition of power by some group or another. That certainly was not the case when I was growing up, and not just when I was growing up, but for many years afterwards. And I presume for many of the years before that as well. People knew what they were fighting for in the Second World War. And on the northern side, they knew what they were fighting for, I think, in the Civil War. So the implicit understanding that these things, the natural rights, equal natural rights, are true and correct, I think that's really wavered quite a bit from what it used to be. And therefore also the ability to really understand the explicit arguments has also wavered. It isn't gone. It's all understandable. It's all teachable. It's all introducible. But fewer and fewer people are doing it. And there is, I think, a decline, at least clearly enough from what I actually know, and even from what seems surely to have been the case when you look at our great military efforts.
People who were once friends of, let's say, the American founding, maybe still are, once friends of the Declaration of Independence, people we could think of as conservatives, many of them have taken up against some amount of that. The liberal proceduralism, it's sometimes called, the thought of John Locke, who gets considered a particular bogeyman in this respect, saying that liberalism has deracinated society. Obviously, these are not new criticisms, but that liberalism and the emphasis on individual rights has led sort of naturally, perhaps, to a state of or a society of hyper individualism, like we can seem to have today, or kind of rootlessness. You're familiar with the kinds of critiques I'm talking about. How do you assess this being a moment where that is where that kind of sentiment is pretty common?
Well, there's something in that, of course, but not enough. I think that to properly understand equal natural rights is fundamental. It's not clear to me how you could possibly argue against slavery unless you argued the truth of equal natural rights. So one has to recognize that the importance of that. It's hard. It's not so easy to see how you could really unlock the enormous talents and potential of so many human beings unless you had a way of life fundamentally grounded on equal natural rights. So I think that the argument and the truth of equal natural rights is still fundamental and important. But as I've said, equal natural rights and your own freedom don't themselves guarantee that you will use those rights properly or in an excellent way. So one needs, together with the teaching of equal natural rights and the exploration of it, a real exploration of virtue, excellence, the heights of art, the heights of thought, the heights of statesmanship. And if in some places they're not equated with equal natural rights, that's also part of the truth of things. It's also the case that to really pursue your rights successfully, you do need a certain set of virtues. You need responsibility. You need industriousness. You need religious toleration. And those things are fundamental and important. But once you begin to have forms of government, ways of life that work against that, and then once one has, even within one's own ways of life, various measures which reduce individual responsibility, you begin to separate equal natural rights a bit from virtue. So my view is simple. There's something in those arguments, but not enough. They don't understand properly both the truth and the deep importance of equal natural rights. But one needs to look also at true human excellence and how one thinks about it and how one develops it. And I'm not sure those other arguments do much of that either.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And I know a thinker you know very well is Martin Heidegger. And I wonder if there isn't a kind of Heideggerian slant to some of these critiques, maybe not all of them, but that goes something like, we have lost our sense of being a people in a land or a world, somehow lost this kind of vital human experience of embeddedness in, like I said, a people, this kind of thing, and that the abstraction is this kind of philosophical thinking can abstract us too much from our connection to soil, community, this kind of thing.
In Heidegger's case, of course, that part of his concern, among his many concerns, went much too far. So that you had in Heidegger an association with the Nazis, which was a deep association for a good period of time, and the ways in which various ways of life are not simply rooted in one's own people and soil, but are cosmopolitan or general. Science, philosophy, much art, and individual natural rights is downplayed or missed or overlooked. So I think there are real dangers if one goes too far down the road with Heidegger. It also, however, of course, as I've said, is true that simple individual equal natural rights don't guarantee a proper understanding of human happiness. And that understanding, which I've put in terms of virtue and character, as well as thought and art, do require a certain thisness or ownness or connectedness. I think there's no question about that. You couldn't have true virtue of character, the full use of the human possibilities in relation to the good things we seek, something that Aristotle discusses, right, so beautifully in his Ethics. You can't have that without real connection and real attachment. So one needs to see both of those things, but recognize that there are always contradictions and difficulties which are not simply overcomable. There are certain universal truths. Part of those truths are the need for certain particular connectedness. There are natural truths, but there are also conventions. And one has to work through those in practice to put together and to live in the most successful and reasonable way, recognizing, however, that a full kind of empty universalism based on nothing and a kind of connection simply to one's own and one's own traditions, even if not good, as we said. Both of those go too far. Having said that, the universal is more connected to reason, and therefore I think it offers more grounds on which to properly understand the practical difficulties in connecting. What you can argue is desirable and reasonable, but what you also have to see is connected to one's own way of life and the place one is, and therefore some of what's not simply rational about that.
And in a way, that is really the inheritance from Greece that you were talking about before. The inheritance being, we don't dress like them, we don't eat like them, we don't lay around like them. But the inheritance is this, the ideal of, like you said, rational excellence, seeking out with the mind what is best, maybe even the distinction between the good and the customary, the distinction between what someone, quote, ought to do because they're a citizen of X place against what someone ought to do just simply.
Yeah, I mean, the distinction between the good and the customary or the natural and conventional is something in a sense discovered by Greek thinkers, and especially in terms of political and human things, in many ways the heart of Socrates and Plato's understanding. And that's fundamental. But from that, one has to see that the customary can never simply equal the natural. And the natural, therefore, also always requires something customary. And in a more direct way, that the ordinary virtues of character, which are the heart of most human happiness, moderation, courage, great pride, and so on, always have a kind of connectedness. So you can show their height rationally and reasonably, but to actually experience them and live them for almost all of us, almost all of the time, requires being in a particular here and now. I think so. One needs a certain modesty in one's expectations also of political life and ordinary life. At the same time, one has an understanding of the heights that are possible for human beings.
Thank you. This reminds me of something I've heard you bring up a few times, which is your sense of the importance of maybe let's call it the contextualist challenge toward making judgments about these things of ultimate importance. I take it that you take seriously the notion that we are always in a particular context rather than another, and that getting from that context to a contextless situation is very difficult, if not impossible. Am I right that maybe you don't think I know you don't think it's impossible, but that it's very difficult? You take that seriously, right?
Sure. Truly understanding what is rationally the case in matters of human happiness and human powers and human abilities and political life, that's very difficult. In other areas, it's less difficult. Mathematics.
Yeah.
The context is less important, obviously,
Hmm.
in terms of understanding what is general and universal.
Hmm.
But for human things, where you begin is important. But one can go beyond that and understand beyond that and rise above that. And one of the great virtues of the United States is that our ground is something universal.
Hmm.
The understanding of equal natural rights and some of the virtues connected with it, so that we are in a particularly, I think, privileged, in the right sense of privileged, position.
Hmm. Yes, your your scare quotes around privileged makes me think. I often think, isn't it good to be privileged, or don't you thank people or something like this? But no, not in the new speak.
No, earned privilege is particularly good, but on the
Yeah.
other hand, even unearned privilege is good. If it's who wouldn't want to be,
Hmm.
who wouldn't want their children to be
Hmm.
brought up in and born into a community that's just,
Hmm.
that's free, that's open to reason, that's open to
Hmm.
human possibilities, that's open to genuine human equality. Anyone who's not infected with odd academic thoughts would want that,
Hmm.
and does want that.
Hmm.
But obviously, in that sense, it's good fortune
Hmm.
to be born into such a community, but
Hmm.
therefore it also becomes a necessity
Hmm.
uh, to keep it that way and to pass it on.
Hmm. You're not a sociologist, and so asking you to speculate about changes in society and the motives in people's breasts and things like this is uh, to be done with apology, which I'm doing right now. Um, but I am struck by how little appreciation there is from many folks for having been born in this country at this time. Maybe there are other times that I can imagine myself preferring, but probably not really, because modern medicine being what it is, all the other things. Um, without asking you either to produce social scientific statistics that you don't have at hand, or without letting us say platitudes, why is it that you think that um, gratitude for um, being born into this society is so rare? Is it, like you said, is it the lack of public service from ordinary people? Why do you think it is?
I think it's too rare among those who go to good schools
Hmm.
and who are young. It's not that it's rare simply, I
Yeah.
wouldn't say. Um, well, one reason is that people take for granted the good things they have
Yeah.
and forget or pay no attention to how things came about that way.
Hmm.
Uh, you can see that in the distance some people who are young have
Hmm.
from free market economies,
Hmm.
uh, somehow imagining that what has come into being has always been there, and there's no connection between that and a particular set of freedoms, rules,
Hmm.
and regulations. So that's one reason. And then
Hmm.
connected to that is miseducation.
Hmm.
Uh, People are taught not just to ignore those factors, but that what was in the past that helped bring about the present, what's general and universal that helped bring about the present.
Hmm.
Too many people are taught that those are bad things or
Hmm.
undesirable things. So I think a combination of miseducation, but then also this tendency always to assume that what you have is always going to be there
Hmm.
and not understand its causes and its grounds and how it came about. I think those bring about that difficulty. But of course, that also means that one can change that and
Hmm.
one can try to show people what the real grounds are that brought about what they take for granted now, which could always disappear,
Hmm.
um, both historically and intellectually.
Hmm. Thank you. That's that's a good answer to my silly question. Um, I want to keep talking about. I'm just very struck by the fact that you brought up as a heart of Western civilization this um, uh, ideal of reason used to its utmost. And I was in graduate school, and when I was in graduate school, I studied English, and I had to spend the last year or two of my time in graduate school re-educating myself. That was where your book came in. But you may be surprised to learn that at English departments, Leo Strauss and people influenced by Leo Strauss are not very often taught, to say the least. But one thing I did read a lot of was, as part of my education, was we all read a lot in graduate school in English of feminist thought of different kinds. That was just a part of what every English graduate student reads, whether they want to or not. There are some aspects of that literature that I'm more sympathetic to than others, but one that I've always thought was extremely self-defeating was the aspect of feminist philosophy that is a critique of the so-called masculine hegemonic idea of reason. I think that is completely self-defeating. And I know a little bit about some very early feminist writers from the 17th century, early 18th century, and almost all of them were Cartesians and took Descartes' philosophy as a great movement in the direction of equality of the sexes. Descartes' idea of reason being disembodied, universally possible, no distinction between souls of men and souls of women. And I found that critique of the ideal of reason extremely, as I said, self-defeating and just wrong, personally. And it didn't match the history that I read. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I agree with that. And Cartesians and several were Lockeans, basically, in their understanding of equal rights.
Yeah.
So I think you're correct about that. And if you even go back to one of the classical sources of an argument about equality, Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic, ultimately, that is an argument about the equality of women fundamentally, in terms of the possibilities of reason, the possibility of the arts, the possibility of the sciences as he sees them. So the common human quality is speech, and ultimately correct or true speech, reason. The bodies matter, and the differences between men and women generally are real, and they're part of this whole question that we've discussed in a way of the universal and the embodied. But the heart of human beings, men or women, is speech and reason. That is the heart. That is what we are. So I agree with your concern or your criticism of them. I'd also suggest that if, as an English PhD, you might want to look at, maybe you already know of some of the works of my good friend, now late, died recently, Paul Cantor, and former roommate.
Yes.
So so there are not many like that.
There are not many Hayekian economist literary critics. But no, Paul Cantor is a friend of some of the people here at the Hamilton Center.
And Paul was one of that group of undergraduate students who were among the first students of Harvey Mansfield, who I studied with as an undergraduate at Harvard.
Were you a student with him at the same time?
Yeah, we were classmates.
Oh,
undergraduate classmates. Yeah.
That's a high.
And we roomed together. We roomed together the first year of graduate school, and then I was married.
Oh,
but for that first year, we roomed together. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's just brilliant, and I've got to say I've read more of his books than yours, but I think that's
It's your field. It's your
it's my
field. You're
field.
forgiven. You're forgiven.
Thank you. That's magnanimous of you.
Yes.
Um, we've been talking about some theoretical and conceptual issues. Um, I'd like to turn a little bit more again toward issues of teaching and the teaching of great books, teaching in great books programs, and teaching of courses called Western Civ. And I want to ask you, why is it that you think there is such resistance to these kinds of programs existing? And is there any argument? Is there any argument from the resistors that you find, you don't have to find it persuasive, but maybe that you find more interesting or persuasive than others?
Well, the reason there's resistance, first of all, is because of who teaches in the academy now. What's the faculty? And the faculty is made up of lots of people who don't believe in any serious way in the importance of teaching these great books. So that's really the first difficulty. The second, and a more concrete difficulty, is that so many faculty now, young faculty in particular, would like to teach what they'd like to teach, and that means their narrow specialty. Even when I was an undergraduate, that was not the case. There were a much more limited number of courses that were offered, and you were not in the business of teaching undergraduates a series of narrow courses. So those are a couple of reasons. But of course, connected to that and behind that is the view that these books, Plato, Aristotle, so on, Shakespeare, they're just one group of books among others, one civilization among others, one culture among others. And in fact, not a very good one in the minds of many people. But again, the fact is, it's not merely one culture among others. It is the heart of what is genuinely free about human beings, the use of the human mind. It's the heart of the understanding of true human excellence, human virtue of character. So Western civilization in that sense, and these great books, have pride of place deservedly because they're good, as well as being our own. That's the argument. No, I'm not satisfied with any of the counter arguments. Someone might say that you need something which is critical, so to speak, of Western civilization. But all of these great books criticize each other.
Of course.
So that you don't need that. So none of the other arguments is satisfactory. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't study some of these other things, of course, but the grounding should be in these great texts. But again, as I've said, unless they're taught well, the benefit is not great enough. And in some ways, there can even be harm. You need to put together the substance of what's taught with excellence among those who actually do the teaching.
Great. Two questions I want to ask following up from that. The first is, when Peter Berkowitz was here at Hamilton last spring, he talked about his, I think he called it something like his unsolicited plan for a curriculum, if anybody asked him, kind of thing. And it was a required, what we could think of as a great books curriculum for all students, but also a requirement for all students as well of studying some other civilization besides Western civilization, maybe not in the same detail, but I didn't have a chance to follow up with him, and I hope to have a conversation with him sooner or later. But I was struck by that, the idea that we would want to know both what is maybe our own, or however we want to describe it, Western Civ well, but then also to know some other important tradition somewhat well also. Would you agree with that? There's not time in the day for everything, of course.
Yeah, and that's one reason I don't agree with that. I don't think it's necessary to do that. I think if one is oriented that way and would like to study carefully one of these other um, civilizations and the works within them, that's fine. But as a general requirement, I don't think it's a good idea. And I don't think it's necessary because, again, the Western civilization or the great books of Western civilization are sufficiently self-critical and sufficiently broad that it's not clear to me what substantively one really would get by forcing on students a second civilization. They'll learn some more facts, they'll learn some more history, but what will they really learn of substantive difference? So, it may be reasonable if one is teaching a Western civilization or great books course, if one wants to include one or two texts from other civilizations. Let's say one wants to do something with Confucius's Analects. But that would be a small piece of a whole because there has to be variation in what one teaches. I don't believe in a kind of set curriculum in the sense that 100% of the books have to be the same.
Yeah.
Most of them, but not each and every one of them, because again, it's what's really fundamental is who's teaching them. So something like that might be okay, but certainly not mandatory. And my view, therefore, would be in opposition to what he's saying.
Well, you can go up to Santa Clara County and give him a piece of your mind.
Yeah, or he could come down here.
He could come down. Yeah, he could come down. Fair enough. The second question I wanted to ask, Mark, also comes from someone else I've spoken to on this podcast, Professor Paul Friedman, a medieval historian at Yale. He teaches in a direct, what I used to call, when I was back there, we have a class called Directed Studies, which is sort of like freshman humanities thing. It's not required for everyone, and that's kind of the deal. We'll offer this, Homer, Plato, Aristotle thing, but you don't have to take it. That's the deal. What Professor Friedman brought up was that those courses, which are taught all in translation, he thinks are not the most useful for the reason that they can't convey, the literary power of ancient texts. They can kind of misrepresent the cultural historical situation. Sometimes that just happens when you translate things. You can kind of drain them of what was, what that undefined, sometimes indefinable, sometimes definable set of qualities that exist in originals. I assume that many of the students who take your freshman humanities class, you're reading these texts in translation. Do you think that do you think that's good enough?
Well, there are 2 or 3 points to make about that. Good translations are necessary, and they go a long way to really uncovering the heart of the texts. Even the best of translations is not the same as the original. Yeah. So one should learn as many of the important original languages as one can.
Yeah.
That's not a reason to limit one's understanding, especially if the translations are good. But you can go a fairly long way if you have good faculty, even with bad translations. When I first started reading these texts, especially the philosophic texts, lots of the translations were bad, or at best were mediocre. It doesn't actually completely prevent one from understanding what was happening. So my answer to that is good translations go a long way. Obviously, knowing the original is important if one can know it, but not having the proper translations is not a reason not to teach these texts. And what you might be missing is often, or in fact, or it's almost always less important
Hmm.
than what you would be gaining.
Hmm.
The historical context, some of the nuances, significant, but not nearly as important as the general
Hmm.
thrust of the ideas and the arguments. That's what's most central, and you can capture that in a good translation.
I agree. One of the most powerful experiences I've ever had with a text was the first time I really read Homer's Iliad, and it was in translation, and yet it had a totally transformative effect on me, and I've been utterly bewitched by Homer ever
Mm.
since. Um, yeah. So we can begin winding things down here a little bit. I feel the sense in which the modern university, American university, is off course. I don't know if you have this same sense. Um, I would love to see a deep cultural renewal, a deep renewal of the proper spirit of the university. Is it possible for something like that to happen? What would it require?
It's a great difficulty because American universities are among the slowest, if not the very slowest, to change themselves. Right? Faculty is there forever now.
Hmm.
And again, the heart of what happens in a university are the people who do the teaching to the students who arrive. It's
Hmm.
not simply the books and the substance. So it would be very difficult to, in a broad way, change the direction of many of our leading universities. You could
Hmm.
slow the decline in various concrete ways. Trustees, if they're sensible, could be much more active. Administrations, if they were sensible, and what a big if that is, could be much more active in what and how they dealt with their faculty. Um, One could easily try to control costs in universities. One could think hard about their nonprofit status, all of the things which enable them to do these strange things. One could change all sorts of laws, which are among the things which cause all of these diversity, equity, and inclusion
Hmm.
bureaucracies. So there are several things you could do to make things a bit better.
Hmm.
How much better than a bit is unclear. So that's on the end of the things which currently exist. The other things one can do is, of course, try new things, as is happening in several places. Summer programs, new colleges, new programs within existing universities. I think that's a central thing that one can do.
Hmm.
One can look especially also to secondary schools and primary schools. If one opened up much more generously various forms of school choice under certain rules, there'd be some things that would happen that you wouldn't like. But
Hmm.
on the whole, I think a lot more people would be better educated coming into universities
Hmm.
than they are now. So
Hmm.
I would look all in those directions primarily,
Hmm.
rather than expecting that there will be some way to, within the foreseeable future, make your place Yale
Hmm.
or Harvard or Princeton or any of the top 50 schools
Hmm.
very much better than they are now. They can be better, you can make them better, but in a fundamental way, that's not, I think, what I would expect. And it's not where I would put my greatest degree of political effort or even
Hmm.
moral effort. I could be
Hmm.
wrong about that, but that's how I would see it now.
Hmm. Well, my place now is happily University of Florida at one of these new programs that you mentioned, and that is a great hope. These kinds of new programs. Mine, Hamilton, is not the only one by any means. There are new ones at um, University of North Carolina, University of Tennessee, and no one knows what the
And
future
an
of them
early
will
one which
be.
started at Arizona State, which in some ways
Yes,
is the model.
yes,
Yeah,
yes. They're the model for us originally.
right.
Um,
And that has a lot to do with trustees, or in the case of state universities, political leaders as well. So it's a good way to make things better.
hmm,
But again, it has its limits, obviously,
right.
given the great number of schools and what one could actually do. That's why, as I said, I think paying attention to primary and secondary education uh, is extremely important, and freeing that up, as I said, through various forms of school choice, charter schools, a lot more homeschooling even. I think all of that's very important as well and promising.
Yeah. I think there the problem seems comparable to higher education where, we're talking in a way about offering alternative institutions or alternative programs within institutions. Just as it's hard to imagine the public school system being reformed without some teachers being fired, it's hard to imagine the universities being reformed without some professors being fired.
Yeah, and even if you fired them, with whom would you be replacing them? So that they're there.
I've got some friends.
Yeah, but maybe not 20,000
Maybe
friends.
not 20,000. No, no.
But the one thing with primary and secondary education, you can change a lot politically, because whereas the most of the major institutions, or at least lots of the major institutions at the college and university level in the US, are private institutions, which you'd think in one sense would be easier to change, but in fact, in many ways are harder to change.
Yeah.
There are a lot of excellent public institutions. We've just mentioned a bunch of them, but nonetheless, you have these important private institutions as well. So, and you have essentially permanent faculty. So you'd really require active effort by a better group of trustees than you often see. There's some, of course, who are good, and certainly better administrations than you almost ever see, though again, there's some good ones there too. So I think it's in some ways more difficult than it is at the primary and secondary level, depending on the state you're in, of course, and the part of the country that you're in.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there are various questions about what goes too far. In my own state of Florida here, there have been various initiatives, including the one that created my own program, that ban the teaching of certain subject matter in higher education, state higher education institutions. I don't see that as a straightforward matter. It's hard to imagine why we would fund a state, why the state of Florida, let's say, would fund the teaching of people who say that the state of Florida shouldn't exist, and it's this kind of thing. But there are academic freedom concerns.
Sure, but there's a lot to be said in the direction that you're going, which is not to ban things, but on the other hand, you don't need to hire people who are likely to teach certain subjects in particularly distorted and harmful ways. They might mention them, they might indicate those arguments, but they don't have to support those arguments. So there's a lot of difference between banning and affirmatively teaching, banning and hiring intelligently. And it's the direction of hiring intelligently and teaching intelligently is the better direction to go, of course, because banning can go both ways. Everything cuts both ways, but in particular, matters such as banning cut both ways.
That's a great point. A lot of people don't often recognize that precedent will come back around on you.
Yeah, exactly.
Very often the case. Well, I so appreciate your time, Mark. This has been a great deal of fun. I could keep talking to you for hours, but yeah, I just want to let you know it's been a great pleasure, and I appreciate you being on the podcast.
Well, thanks very much, and it's been a pleasure for me as well.
All right.